really appreciate this giant lectern in case the talk doesn't go well. That's a protection. Teresa talked a little bit about why I'm here, and I just want to really emphasize my thanks, because it's pretty, to use the word extraordinary, it's pretty extraordinary that I'm here. I luckily have figured out a way to sort of make it worth my while in terms of not just doing this, but also visiting my college roommate up in Grand Rapids tomorrow.
Oh.
We're going to meet at a Kalamazoo Growlers game. What I thought I would do is I've done a talk on the regiment a couple different places. I'm going to do a Tiffin spin tonight. I am going to start with sort of a little bit about who the leaders of the regiment were. And it's a little bit of a mishmash, I hope that's okay, but I instead of just sort of telling the story of the regiment, which the book does, I thought what I do is really look more closely at some of the men, and in particular some of the men whose letters I used as sources. And hopefully in talking about that it will become more clear why I ended up here in Tiffin, because many of the sources are actually from letters from locals. But again, thank you, Teresa, for having me, and thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it. I know it's a week of relaxation for a lot of people, so I appreciate you coming out. You can move to the next slide. Again, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading all this, but this is just a quick little summation of what the 65th New York Infantry did, where they were. One of the things I did on the way out here was break up the trip, so I didn't have to drive 10 hours, and I stopped at Gettysburg. I take my AP US history class to Gettysburg every year. Haven't been able to do it the last 2 years with the pandemic. So I confess I missed it, and I stayed out there one night and actually visited one grave of a Tiffin boy who's buried in the National Cemetery there. But I also always make a trek to the regimental monument. If you've been to Gettysburg, you know it's loaded with monuments. Any regiment that fought there wanted to make a record that they were there. The 65th happened to be on top, this is very small, but happened to be on top of Culp's Hill. And on the side of the monument, actually, it says, served in every battle in the Army of the Potomac, which is pretty much true. They were a day late to Antietam. They didn't quite get into the Second Bull Run, but they, as you can see, they were busy. You can move on to the next slide. How did I come to this interest? Growing up in my house, we had this document hanging on the wall of our family room. This is the appointment paper of Lieutenant Timothy Carroll, who was named corporal in June of 1863, so right before Gettysburg. As a child, my family took me out to Gettysburg along with my 3 sisters, who were way less interested in it than I was. They liked the motel pool the best, I think. But I was fascinated. And when we came home, we wondered, we thought, this document shows that Timothy Carroll, who happens to be my great-great-grandfather, was named a corporal right before Gettysburg. So that piqued our interest. I recently found a letter my mom sent, actually, to the National Archives about it, and then she just got a form letter in response. But years later, I have been teaching for 32 years, but my first 10 years was in schools in Connecticut and Maryland. When I went down to Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C., my first break, I went to the National Archives. This was pre-internet, but you could, if you knew your relative and the unit they were in, you could actually get a lot of information from the military records, but also from the pension records. And I spent hours there, and kind of my interest was piqued. I spent the next several years traveling to pretty much all the battlefields that they fought at, reading all the secondary accounts of those battles. And then when I moved back up to New York, where I'm from, I continued with this interest. I did a talk at my school in Maryland before I left. I won a grant to travel and follow the exact route of Grant's army against Lee at the end of the war, which was fun. And especially memorable because my dad went with me for part of it, my late father, and he was real into it and a great navigator. So anyway, this is the document that got me interested. It now hangs on my own wall. And you can move to the next slide. So introducing some of the characters. First character I want to talk about is this gentleman, General John Cochran. Cochran was a congressman from New York and a Democrat. So as such, but he was in favor of pushing the war. As a Democrat, political supporter of the war. Of course, Abraham Lincoln was looking to get as many Democrats lined up on the side as possible as so-called political generals. Cochran was a classic example of that. He didn't really know that much about military stuff, but he was a valuable ally. He's an interesting character. He was one of the gentlemen involved with a little bit of an escapade behind Ambrose Burnside's back after the Battle of Fredericksburg. When I read about that, I was excited that he was in on that. He's also a graduate of Hamilton College, which is my own alma mater, so we have that connection. As I explored him a little bit, I learned that he was notable for, you can go to the next slide, and you go to the next slide too, actually, for making a very early speech talking about how to prosecute the war, which was quite startling in terms of when it was made. A lot of his letters are in the New York Historical Society. One of the nice things about doing this kind of work is you get to go to these beautiful archives or beautiful museums and see incredible collections, but also a lot of times the reading rooms are just stunning. The New York Historical Society, which is nicknamed New York City's attic, has a great museum upstairs with about 10 million chairs, but along with a lot of other awesome stuff. But the library is amazing. And my daughter, I have two daughters. One of them is not particularly interested in history, although she's an artist and she did help design the book, which I thought came out really well, the cover. The other one is really into history, and she's accompanied me on some of these trips. One of my colleagues calls me a fool because I go to cemeteries now so much, but I get to all the battlefields, so I find now visiting the graves of the members of the regiment and putting a flag there in honor, that is something I enjoy doing. And my daughter does too. She's working now, so she couldn't come out on this trip with me. But one of the things we discovered when we went to the New York Historical Society, we looked for a folder of letters of John Cochran, and it's amazing what you can get your hands on. I'm opening up the folder and going through letters, and all of a sudden there's this weirdly shaped document that's a little strange. It turns out it's a patent application. Go to the next slide. Cochran, it turns out, applied for a patent for a steamboat paddle innovation. And in those days, patents were all directed to the president. So I'm holding in my hands a document signed by Andrew Jackson, which I kind of looked around thinking, am I really supposed to be holding this? But it was really a cool thing. And it had little to do with the regiment story, but I realized after a while, it's such a cool thing to have as a picture, and I can reference it in terms of the chapter I talk about with John Cochran. So you can move on. So Cochran, as I said, made a speech that wasn't exactly the Gettysburg Address, but in the speech he does a couple things that are really interesting, I think. So I'll read a couple excerpts. First of all, he talks about secession and what was going on. I declare, therefore, that the war is not of our originating, but has been forced upon us by a crafty enemy. Now, what is their object? Why, their object is to tear down this proud, noble, and beneficent government, to establish a reign of terror, anarchy, and confiscation in the land, to implant upon this, our soil, the hideous doctrine of the right of secession, so that when one state secedes, another may secede, and still another, and another, so that within 48 hours, by the light of their reason and the exactness of their judgment, you may establish on this continent 34 independent governments. 34, did I say? Why not 34 merely, but every county and every city and every village and hamlet, nay, every person who shall suffer from indigestion at the dinner table, may claim the same right. And thus soldiers would follow the confusion and disorder which would plunge into dismay and ruin the best and most benevolent governments in the world. I should say this speech was made in December 1861 before the regiment, so he's really trying to get the men fired up. By December 1861, those of you that know that they've been training for a while. They haven't really gotten into anything. They did go, a part of the regiment did go into one little skirmish, but other than that, they really haven't seen any action. So this is trying to get them fired up. You can go to the next slide. What makes this speech, what made the speech so astounding when I first found it, even though it is a little longish, I think, and he's kind of a blowhard, quite frankly, is he makes this proposal. He says, if necessary to save this government, I would plunge their whole country, black and white, into one scene of indiscriminate warfare. You have arms in your hands, and those arms are placed there for the purpose of exterminating the enemy, unless he submit to law, order, and the Constitution. If he will not submit, seize everything that comes in your way. Set fire to the cotton, export the cotton, take property wherever you may find it. Take the slave and bestow him upon the non-slave holder, if you please. Do to them as they would do to us. Raise up a party of interest against the absent slaveholder. distract their councils, and if this should not be sufficient, take the slave by the hand, place a musket in it, and in God's name bid him strike for the liberty of the human race. Of course, with the Emancipation Proclamation, eventually you did have African Americans, many of them freed slaves, fighting for the Union. But in December 1861, this was a very radical proposal, and not something that Lincoln was willing to go for at all. So Cochran's staking himself out as somebody who's, in a sense, trying to make a name for himself, but also trying to get the men fired. Now, I said before, Cochran did not have much military experience. So his second in command is this gentleman, a guy named Alexander Shaler. And you can go to the next slide. I have a few pictures of him. Shaler, who eventually grew, I think, one of the most interesting mustaches of any. In fact, occasionally I'm on all these goofy Facebook groups. And one of the things they ask sometimes is like, who has the best facial hair? Of course, Ambrose Burnside is most famous. But I would give Shaler's mustache a run for your consideration. But Shaler had been in the 7th New York Militia pre-war as its major. He thus was familiar with military drill. He had experience training troops. Cochran brought him in, and I have some letters that actually talk about it. Some of the men say, Cochran's a nice guy, but Shaler's the one that really is doing all the work. Shaler's the one that's kind of drilling us. He wasn't beloved, at least from some of the letter writers I have. But once the war started, they did respect him a lot because they felt like he had trained them well. You can go to the next slide and the next one. There's a lot of pictures of Shaler. Some of you may, if you know more than I know about medals, you might recognize. Shaler is most noteworthy not just because he was good at training the men, but he actually won the Congressional Medal of Honor as well, which is another cool discovery for me as I pursue the regiment. Keep going. Eventually he's going to become mayor of Ridgefield, New Jersey, where he's buried. You can keep going. This is a rendering that I got from the New York State Military History Museum, which is also where I found the flag that adorns the cover of the book. I was lucky enough to meet the archivist who brought the flag out, and my daughter and I got to see it along with a small note from Abraham Lincoln recommending that Shaler gets promoted to Brigadier General, which my daughter got to handle, which was really cool. It's obviously a little glorified and romanticized, but Shaler is going to play a key role in the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, which was part of the Chancellorsville campaign when the 6th Corps was ordered to fake an attack on Fredericksburg, and eventually was ordered to try to take Marie's Heights, the famous stone wall. You can go to the next picture. Some of you, probably many of you, have seen this photo before. This is the stone wall at Fredericksburg. I tell my students in my Civil War class and my AP classes that any place in the Civil War that has a "the" before it means horrible things happen. So you have the cornfield at Antietam, the wheat field at Gettysburg, the stone wall at Fredericksburg. And in December 1862, this is a position that the Confederates did incredible damage to Burnside's attack. But in May 1863, with a smaller contingent, only about a division, a little over a division defending it, the 6th Corps is ordered to actually attack and seize this. And this picture, which is often depicted to show the Battle of Fredericksburg and the horror of the war. I know in the Ken Burns series, for example, they go to this picture because I don't think there's another picture of it. But this actually was taken after the 6th Corps, including great-great-grandpa, took the wall. You can see, it's a grisly scene. You can see some bodies of Confederates there along with rifles and other accoutrements. So Shaler was one of the key guys who helped rally the troops in moving against Marie's Heights and helping to take the position. For this, he won the Medal of Honor. His career with the 65th ended rather abruptly, however, in early May 1864. Again, those of you that know, I apologize if I'm insulting your intelligence, but in May 1864, Ulysses S. Grant took over the Union effort, decided to accompany General George Meade with the Army of the Potomac to take on Robert E. Lee. And on May 5th, 1864, the Battle of the Wilderness started, one of the most horrendous battles, I think, of the war. On May 6th, as it was going, it was a bit dicey. The 65th, which had been ordered to watch the wagons in the background, which is a pretty boring but very safe, a relatively safe job. Grant needed all the men he could have, so he ended up calling them up. And unfortunately for the 65th, they were positioned at the literal extreme right flank of the Union Army, the furthest right of any regiment, which was not anchored in anything. It was in the middle of the woods. And late in the day, General John Gordon, one of the better Confederate generals, realized that that was an exposed flank, and he launched a fairly famous attack on it. And Shaler, one of the great sources I found at the New York Historical Society also was Shaler's diary. And again, this is the kind of stuff that I get excited about. At least I'm working through the actual leather-bound diary, wondering if I'm really allowed. Written in infinitesimally small handwriting. It took me like an hour before I realized people use magnifying glasses. And the archivist took pity on me and gave me a magnifying glass. Then she said, "This is actually digitized, so I'm not supposed to have you handling the diary, but you're handling it so carefully." So I was like, but in his diary, which also talks all about his eventual imprisonment, he describes what happened in the wake of Gordon's attack. And I'm going to come back to this attack later with another character. By extraordinary efforts on the part of Sedgwick, the Sixth Corps commander, and other officers, the panic was stopped at the road and a line formed to advance against the enemy with. I had contributed in my efforts, and galloping to the right to collect what scattering men might have taken the road to the rear, and to see to the more perfect organization of that part of the line, found myself in an instant surrounded by a dozen or more butternuts, each having his gun pointed in the direction of my innocent carcass. A summons to surrender and dismount was answered precisely as a good soldier would obey any lawful order of his superior. To my extreme disgust and mortification, I found myself a prisoner of war and captured to a dozen or more of straggling vagabonds who, with half the members of my fellows, I could have driven from the woods or captured with ease. My sword was jerked from me by a nasty, snot-nosed ruffian, but in a moment after that, when the danger of my retaliation was over, an officer stepped from behind a tree and claimed it. My horse, a splendid stallion, was to share my fate. So unfortunately for Shaler ended up imprisoned down in Charleston. There's a somewhat famous moment in the war where the Confederates actually let out a number of Union officers out onto the exposed to fire under Union naval bombardment to try to get them to stop the bombardment. They got a lot of grief for that. Shaler was one of the ones that was exposed. But he ended up finishing the war as a division commander out in the West once he was exchanged. You can go on. The next commander of the regiment, I should say, by the way, Cochran ended up, after complaining about Burnside behind Burnside's back, he ended up getting into trouble for that. He eventually resigned his commission claiming illness, but it's more likely actually for political reasons he got pushed out. Shaler took over after that. When Shaler was captured, this gentleman, Joseph Hamblin, from Massachusetts originally, took his place. Hamblin would end the war as a brevet brigadier general and would be associated with the chasseurs for the rest of the war. I should say that the 65th New York originated as the first United States chasseurs. At the beginning of the war, a lot of you know, regiments wanted to stand out, so you've heard of the zouaves. Maybe they dressed with fezzes and baggy pants, and chasseurs was just another chance to sort of have a different uniform than the fancy, and eventually they gave up those fancy uniforms and subbed for the regular Union uniforms and became the 65th New York. But he'd be associated with the 65th and became a much admired figure among those who knew him. He was described by one New York soldier, I think you can go through to the next slide. A tall, well-proportioned, genteel-looking man with a bold, fearless face, which seemed to me a perfect model of manly beauty. There was an honest frankness, a rosy freshness, a genial cheerfulness that went direct to the heart and gave the impression that there was nothing narrow, mean, or small in the composition of its owner. There was an easy air of graceful dignity, blended with good nature and sociability. In bodily formation, this man, chiseled in marble, would have rivaled the Apollo Belvedere. He was one of nature's masterpieces and the finest I ever saw. By his many engaging qualities, he won the affection of the men. They loved, honored, almost idolized him. If you go to the next slide. He's a pretty good-looking guy, I guess. And then the next one. One of the great sources I had was he wrote a bunch of letters home that his daughter then published. He only lived a few years after the war, but his daughter published at a vanity press a book of his letters, which I found and used. After Shaler's capture at the Battle of the Wilderness, and again, a lot of you know, after the Battle of the Wilderness, the Union Army moved south, trying to get around Lee's right flank, and Lee cut him off at a place called Spotsylvania. again, perhaps the worst of all the battles I think I've ever read about in the Civil War. And Hamblin on May 15th, after the 65th had seen very heavy duty on May 10th and May 12th, they lost, if I remember, 97 men of the regiment killed, wounded, or captured, including Major, I think Major at this point, Thomas Higgenbotham from Tiffin, who was wounded and captured at Spotsylvania. We're going to meet him in a few minutes. This is Hamlin on May 15th, writing home. This is the 12th day of the campaign, the 10th of fighting. I am unhurt, but my regiment musters but 103 men fit for duty. The regiment started, I should say, just under 1,000 men. They lost a lot from disease, certainly, but also from casualties. At Gettysburg, it was about 260 men. So between the Wilderness, where they lost, I want to say 57 men, and Spotsylvania, where they lost 97 men. Spotsylvania was the worst of all their battles, but they've taken a terrible pounding. The brigade has suffered fearfully. We have done more fighting than during all our previous experience in the war. The Army is greatly fatigued by the incessant fighting and marching, but still confident and determined. I am so sleepy I can scarcely keep awake to write this. Day and night, in sunshine and rain, mud and dust, we are active. I marvel at the endurance of our men. I always thought that last line sort of captured maybe why the men respected him so much. He had that connection to them. He understood what they were going through. And you can go to the next slide, Nate. Another later letter written in the Petersburg lines, June 22nd, 1864. We were within musket range of Petersburg and have been for 4 days. The house in which I write this is perforated with musket and cannonballs. The shell struck it just before I began this letter. 4 bullets came through the cupboard wall behind my back, breaking all the china in the closet this morning. Many men are wounded or killed hourly around us, but we are as yet all right and expect to be relieved tonight. Last night I had a few hours sleep, the first for 2 days and nights. I'm now commanding the brigade and have been busy at night superintending the advance of rifle pits in our front. Remember me to all our good uncles, aunts, and cousins. The longing to spend a few hours in quiet at home is at times very strong. Okay, go to the next one. So again, I appreciate your patience with me talking about mostly non-Tiffin guys, but we're here in Tiffin, of course, and Company K was raised largely in Tiffin. I only have one photograph of a Tiffin soldier or officer, so I'll throw that out to you guys in case anybody knows of anybody that might have photos of distant family members or ancestors. But the captain of the company was Thomas Higginbotham from Tiffin, and he brought men to New York into the regiment. I'm going to introduce him next. I'll just say something about this source. Notice it says property of the New York State Military Museum. They're in the New York State Capitol. Supposedly they had a wall of all the New York officers who were killed during the war. Sorry, spoiler alert. And you can actually see in the top of this picture, use my pointer, evidence of where this was pinned into the wall. And eventually those came down off the wall, and the New York Military History Museum in Saratoga got it. But I think he's a very thoughtful looking guy, and maybe I'm biased because I've read some of his letters too. We go to the next slide. This picture I got from the New York Military History Museum. I first meet him early when he's just a captain, where he writes a letter home talking about the battlefield after the Battle of Williamsburg. And I should go back and say how much I appreciate Ohio, because when I never quite finished my story. When I finally decided, having read all these books and visited all these battlefields and taught a Civil War course for years, that there's really no one else on the planet that knew as much about the 65th New York, and I realized that's a pretty small thing to brag about. But I thought if someone's going to write a book about this regiment, there was no. Well, a lot of times an older soldier in the 1880s would write the memoir of the regiment. There was no memoir of the 65th, so I thought, all right, I guess I'm the guy. So when I started looking for primary sources, again, I went to the New York Historical Society, but I also online found that Bowling Green and the Ohio Historical Society have not only organized letters, but they actually indexed them by regiment. So I could literally just look at 65th New York, and I found scores of letters, maybe 30 letters from Tiffin boys who had written to the Seneca Advertiser or the Tiffin Weekly Tribune, which I think is that Verge now? Is it Advertiser or Tribune? and a letter from Higginbotham reported on what he saw of his first real battlefield, which is Williamsburg. The 65th arrived after the battle was over, and Higginbotham writes, "Soon I came to a clearing in front, where trees had been felled for a barrier. And here every tree and branch showed marks of musketry. Muskets and accoutrements lay upon the ground on every side, and even letters from home and miniatures were not scarce. These were sad sights to see, but not the saddest. I stepped over a log, and there lay a man shot through the breast, a powerful fellow, killed in the prime of life. He lay upon his back with his knees drawn up and his hands raised in front of him. It was the first I had seen, and it sent a thrill of horror through me. 2 others fell while pierced with each other's bayonets. But the most affecting scene of all was a man who had been mortally wounded and now lay on his back with the likeness of a young woman and child in his stiffened hand, and his open eye, cold in death, fixed upon it. It was a hard thing to throw that man into a pit as you would bury a dog." That's one of the more moving letters I was able to find. And again, I think it shows something about Higginbotham and his sensitivity. You can go to the next one. Jumping ahead a little bit, one of the frustrating things about writing a book is there's always going to be sources that are found after it's done. And I self-published it. I tried some publishers that didn't take any interest, but I self-published it on Amazon. And one of the advantages is you can always upload a new copy of it. So I remember telling Teresa that in my first edition I had referenced Tiffin County, which of course doesn't exist. It should say Seneca County. So I fixed that. The bad news is you're always going to find new stuff, and eventually you just have to realize, like, it's done. So this letter is actually found after the book, but this is a letter from Higginbotham, and the date is worth noting. October 3rd, 1864, this was in the Seneca Advertiser. Dear B, he's on his way to rejoin the regiment. If you remember, I said he had been wounded and captured at Spotsylvania, which is in May of 1864. He's now exchanged, and he writes this letter home as he's on his way. He says, "I'm about to proceed up the valley with a train tomorrow and hope to gain the regiment in a few days." At this point, the 65th had been sent out to the Shenandoah Valley with Phil Sheridan. Some of you know Sheridan in the fall of 1864 was given the task of defeating Jubal Early and clearing out the Shenandoah Valley as a source of food for Lee's army, and clearing it out also as a problematic spot where the Confederates had a penchant for Stonewall Jackson, then Lee and the whole army during the Gettysburg campaign, and earlier at the Antietam campaign. So the 65th, the rest of the 6th Corps was sent out with Sheridan, and that's where Higginbotham was going. This is the part where I feel like, I talked to Teresa about this today. He's a little bit critical of Tiffin. So I'm just going to lay that out there at the start, the people of Tiffin. I had hoped to visit Tiffin and see you before this, thinking that some notice would be taken of the return of my old company. On September 1st, 1864, the original 3-year volunteers that had not re-upped, that had not re-signed as veterans, were mustered out, and a group came back to Tiffin. I will not attempt, I had hoped to visit Tiffin and see you before this, thinking that some notice would be taken of the return of my old company, in which case I certainly would have gone out with it. I will not attempt to conceal the fact that I am somewhat hurt to think that the citizens of Tiffin should so overlook the services of as brave a company as ever left the state of Ohio or any other state in the Union. They were no hireling soldiers bought up so much a pound, referencing the bounties that later soldiers often got when they signed up. When the rebellion first broke out, the president called for men to defend the capital, and they responded, not asking how much was the pay or how much the bounty. What company or regiment can show a better record than they? They are an honor to the country and state from which they came. These men patiently endured all the hardships that fall to the lot of a soldier, always looking forward to the day when they would march home in triumph. The bones of their comrades have been left on every field from Fair Oaks to Petersburg, and all who knew them must admit that they did their whole duty. Yet there is no authorized person to say to them on their return, "We thank you," in the name of your town and country. I tell you, the time will come when they will be honored as they deserve to be. When their backs are bowed by age and their hair is gray, another generation will point to them and say, "He was at Fair Oaks or Malvern Hill. He fought with McClellan at Antietam, or helped form that living bulwark which rallied back the enemy at Gettysburg." They have seen many other hard-fought fields and never turned their backs to the enemy except at the word of command. The oldest guard of Napoleon might envy them their fame, for they never saw such fields in Spotsylvania and the wilderness. I only mention to say that what I would have been proud to say in a more public manner, for I know the worth of that little band of veteran heroes. I like to think we're honoring them today, for showing up today. You can go to the next slide. I noted the date, October 3rd, 1864. If you know about Sheridan's campaign, and some of you may know, there are basically three big battles that were fought. On September 19th, Sheridan defeated Early at Winchester in what's called the Battle of Opequon Creek, if you're a Union person, or 3rd Winchester for the Confederates. Generally, most people call it 3rd Winchester. 2 days later at Fisher's Hill, Early had retreated to a strong position across the valley but didn't have enough men. He got flanked and badly defeated. And it looked like Early was cleaned out and everything was going to be fine. Sheridan actually left the army for a time, visited, conferring about what to do with the 6th Corps and whether it should be sent back to the Petersburg lines. And it just so happened that Higginbotham arrived shortly after this letter was written, took command of the regiment, and on October 19th, 1864, early in the morning, no pun intended, Jubal Early attacked a relatively unprepared Union army at Cedar Creek. One of the most beautiful battlefields, by the way, if you ever get to go to the Shenandoah Valley. The valley itself is gorgeous, but Cedar Creek, which they're beginning to do a little bit better job preserving and buying up more land for, is a gorgeous, gorgeous battlefield. At Cedar Creek, while rallying the men as they're being thrown back in this surprise attack, Higginbotham was shot and killed instantly. And the picture on the left is about as close as I could get to the general area where he was probably killed, where the 65th eventually broke and had to move north where they were rallied. Famously, Sheridan arrives. General Wright, the 6th Corps commander who's in command while Sheridan was gone, actually had done a pretty good job of getting them organized. But Sheridan arrives, rides all along the line, inspires the men, they counterattack, and win a tremendous victory. Probably one of the most underrated battles in terms of importance, because if you can pay attention to the date, this was only weeks before the election. Sherman's capture of Atlanta, of course, September 1st, 1864 was big. But Cedar Creek also played a big role because it really made it clear that the valley was under Union control from now on. Early was never going to be the same. Speaking of big cemeteries, Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, I think, has about 400,000 people in it, including Charley Ebbets of Ebbetsfield fame and Boss Tweed. And I want to say her name is Laura Kern. Somebody might know this better than me. The woman who starred in Our American Cousin, the play that Abraham Lincoln went to when he was assassinated. She's also buried in Greenwood Cemetery. It's a gorgeous arboretum and an amazing place in the middle of this huge city in Brooklyn. And Higginbotham ended up buried there. I looked for where he ended up. I figured he'd be back at Tiffin because he was an officer, and sometimes officers have more wherewithal to preserve the body and send it home. So I was very surprised when I stumbled online on this picture and realized that he was not exactly in my backyard, but within, because driving from Westchester County, where I lived, to Brooklyn, it may as well be driving from New York to Ohio, actually, with the traffic. But his gravesite is here in Brooklyn. I got permission from Teresa to put her image up there. And I should say, she sells herself short. She's very humble, and I just want to say, I started out with this Tiffin connection by, I found that, I figured there were people buried here from the regiment. Again, like I said, once I've been to all these battlefields, I've been trying to connect with soldiers and lay flags at their graves. And I saw Green Lawn Cemetery was the big cemetery in Tiffin. And I connected with somebody from the cemetery. There's a phone number on the website. If it wasn't you, Teresa, I forget who it was. Eventually, Teresa connected with me, and not only, got me interested in coming out to see the graves, but detailed this incredible map. I should have put a picture of that up. She walked the cemetery herself and found almost all of the chasseurs that are buried there, the members of the regiment. And when I made it out here, I met Teresa and her dad, and we got the tour of the cemetery. And then I apologize for forgetting the name of this soldier, but the grave that Teresa's staying next to is the one grave she wasn't able to find. And we kind of scoured the whole cemetery, and we're about ready to give up. But she said there's one area where there's a lot of Civil War soldiers, and sure enough, most of them from Ohio regiments. But just off this, if I remember, actually I went there today, so there's a group of Ohio soldiers, and there's one a little bit off from the side. And by the way, I'm now planting much more substantial flags than the pathetic little flag I had this day. But I was happy to see when I came back today, that little flag is still there, along with the big one. So, McAllister, I think perhaps his body is not buried there. I think that might just be a memorial to him. But there's 5 or 6. There's a new one that my daughter, who helps me with this, what she does is she looks at the regimental roster, which is digitized, and then compares it to this database called Find a Grade, and where she finds names that match and dates that match, she's able to locate these graves. And she just found another one like a couple weeks ago. His name is Charles J Lambertson, and he's at Green Lawn in Section G, but unfortunately I couldn't find Section G. And this afternoon I tried to go back and see if I could find him, but I wasn't able to find him, so there's a challenge for the Tiffinites. Mm-hmm. If you want to look for him. It could be an unmarked grave, or it could be that it's so worn down that you can't see it, and I know there's significant damage done also for the tornado. So it might just not be there. Last year when I came, again, I came originally with the thought that I would just go to Green Lawn. And then I realized there were some other local cemeteries that could potentially have people. I went kind of blind into them. I know I've been reading a lot of quotes, but Charley Crockett is one of the Tiffin boys that I want to read a little bit from, because I think I think what I've tried to do in the book is try to show that these are regular people who just were put under incredible circumstances, and they tried to retain their humanity in these difficult times. I did bring one genuine artifact. On the left, that's First Sergeant William Kissinger's grave, which I revisited today, and I planted a bigger flag there today. There was no flag there, so he might have gotten missed from the I guess, Memorial Day. But now there's a big flag there. And I found online his application for the GAR, which was reasonably priced, which is good for me because I'm a humble teacher. And if anybody's interested in looking at it after, feel free to take a look at it. But so Kissinger's there on the left. His brother, I think, Sam Kissinger, was an officer who's buried in Toledo, who wrote a number of letters that I used. But Leroy Crockett and Charley Crockett were 2 of the first letter writers I was able to obtain. I went to the Army Heritage Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the Crockett letters were there. And I don't know quite the dynamic here, but both Leroy and Charley write to a woman named Nellie. Leroy, whose grave is at the Lovell School Cemetery, is that what it's called, I think, up in on the way to Green Springs. Leroy writes an early one about their first experience in battle at a place called Lewinsville, this little skirmish. He says, one shot struck the ground close to my feet, throwing the dirt all over me. A shell struck a tree over our heads and burst, filling my mouth with rough bark as I was about to give a command. By this time, our artillery got in position and soon drove them from the field. Nellie, you see by this, I have seen the sights and come off with a whole hide. But the music of those rifle balls and the hissing of the shells, together with the muttering and grumbling of cannonball, was most grand. So I don't know the relationship between Leroy and Nellie, but here's Charley's. I'm going to read 2 excerpts from Charley to Nellie. This is December 1st, 1861. So this is just before that speech that was delivered by John Cochran that I read from before. Nellie, you mustn't think the poor soldiers have such hard times. As far as I've seen, they seem to enjoy their new way of living first rate. But they do think of their friends at home very often, and think how they would like to see them, if it was only for a little while. 'Tis very tempting to read about the big piles of nice apples lying under the trees. I think that's from Nellie's letter to him. I should like to take a walk in the orchard myself. We can get apples for 3 or 5 cents apiece, but they're not like the ones at home. Underlined. So a little flirtation there, in case you're wondering if he really is flirting. I have another one where he says, let's see if I get it right here. Nellie, this is from, from a little bit later, I think early in 1862. Nellie, I'm beginning to feel proud of our regiment. We got the praise of being the best regiment in every respect except in numbers in Keyes divisions. Nellie, the mud has mostly all disappeared and we're having better weather than we had in the winter. I think there's a prospect now of closing up this rebellion in short measure, but it may take longer than I think. I should like to have a crack at some of that maple sugar the Buckeyes are making. Nellie, you may eat a lump for me, and I'll take the duplicate from your lips when I get back. Now don't pout, but didn't you promise me a kiss? And I should expect it to be given with interest, with an underline of interest. So definitely something going on between Charley and Nellie. I'm not sure about Leroy. Charley Crockett, unfortunately, if you can make it out, was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness, mortally wounded and died shortly after. Leroy ended up transferring to a different regiment, and I thought originally he had survived the war, but today I realized, after having visited his gravesite, he in fact became a lieutenant colonel in an Ohio regiment. I apologize for not knowing the number, and ended up serving out in the West, and he died outside Vicksburg of disease. So neither Crockett brother came back. Going up to the Egbert Cemetery, I know there's another name for it too, something Ridge Cemetery, but the Egbert Cemetery right up on Route 100, you can find Charley Crockett's grave along with another member of the 65th. And today I found another guy up in Green Spring also. You can go to the next one. This picture was taken by Teresa, and I actually stopped at this cemetery on a whim on the way up to Clyde, because there were a few guys buried in Clyde also that I just happened upon. I want to see James McPherson's grave. He was a pretty well-known general, and it turns out there were 3 chasseurs buried nearby. But I stopped at this cemetery and actually looked through it quickly, didn't find Crockett, and went home and realized he was there. So today I paid him a proper visit, and I put a flag in that GR star that Teresa put up on the, it was broken off the stand. But I think you might have wedged it in the ground because it was still there.
Was it?
It was standing up, so I put the flag in the star, so it's properly displayed. You can go to the next one. At least one, actually, we just mentioned Higginbotham. Lafayette Burns is another letter writer who didn't make it back to Tiffin. Burns is one of 4 65th New York guys who were killed at Gettysburg, and one of 2 that are buried at the National Cemetery there. They've misidentified the regiment. The other guy is a guy named John Clark, and it says 65th under his name. But I think I said before, I take my APRIS students to Gettysburg every year, and we start at the cemetery nearby where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And the last few years, now that I've written the book, I've started to read Lafayette Burns's obituary from the Seneca Advertiser. His last letter that was printed in the Seneca Advertiser was July 3rd, 1863, which happens to be the day he was mortally wounded, just coincidentally. But I promise I won't read the whole thing, but it talks about Burns, son of David Burns of Big Spring Township, Seneca County, Ohio, was born February 9th, 1837, was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg July 3rd in the 25th year of his age. Lafayette volunteered, went into the 1st U.S. Chasseur Regiment, was in the siege of Yorktown in the spring of 1862, was in the battles of Fair Oaks and Seven Pines, was in the 6 days fighting in front of Richmond. On the 7th day was in the terrible battle of Malvern Hill. Was with the Army through all the fighting in Maryland, including the Battle of Antietam. Was in the Battle of Fredericksburg under Burnside. He was with his regiment when it captured Fredericksburg under Hooker, or rather under Sedgwick, and the same day his division stormed and took Salem Heights. So a picture of Marie's Heights and the stone wall is associated with that. He was with Sedgwick's corps through the terrible fighting after Salem Heights were taken, and finally was in the memorable Battle of Gettysburg, where he was killed by the explosion of a shell, pieces of which struck him in the side and lower jaw. He was carried to the nearest hospital, where he died about 1 hour after he was struck. Young Burns was a man of good habits, was retiring and unassuming in his manner. He had the confidence, respect, and affection of his comrades in arms, was courageous, and never faltered in the hour of danger. He never was sick a day during his term of service, and in all the above-mentioned battles, he never received an injury of any kind until he fell. It'd be difficult to find a soldier that had passed through more hard-fought battles than he did. The nation owes him a debt of gratitude. Peace to his ashes. And I confess, when I first read that, having used a bunch of his letters and thought to read it to my class, I got a little broken up the first time. Getting better at it now. So I'm Irish, so we get kind of emotional. Okay, next slide, sorry. I'm going to breeze through the next part, but the final commander of the regiment was this gentleman, Colonel Henry Fisk. He's buried up in New Hampshire. We'll go to the next one. And I'm going to close with just a couple of descriptions to get back to this point I want to make about how these are regular guys. This is Frederick Volk. Volk's diary was the best source I had for the period when the 65th New York went out to Ohio. In the winter of 1864, they actually served as prison guards. Their division was sent out to Johnson's Island outside Sandusky. I don't know if you've ever been up there, but if you haven't, I recommend it. There's a beautiful little Confederate cemetery there, which is a testament to how hard it was on the Confederate officers that were housed there. I was lucky enough to take a class in Ashland, at Ashland University. On the way home, I went up to Johnson's Island once. And Volk's diary, which is at Syracuse University, was an amazing source of his diary for the whole year of 1864. Unfortunately, he was wounded at Spotsylvania, and a lot of his diary after that was talking about recovering in New York and going out on lots of rides with lots of different women. But he's the best source for me and for the regiment in terms of the time spent at Johnson's Island. If you go to the next slide, he's buried in New Jersey. I found his grave fairly recently. It's very close to where I work, actually. And he talks about, again, these are regular guys, so I want to talk about his experience in Sandusky. He says, oh, sorry, I lost my place here. Yeah, he says, there's a couple different letters that I have where they talk about how welcoming the citizens of Sandusky were. They had this horrible long train ride, and some of the men got access to whiskey. Hamblin talks about in one of his letters how they're trying to corral the guys and keep them on the train. But when they arrived, Volk talks about how the officers were well received. Again, I apologize for the PG-13 here, but they gave us plenty to eat, and the ladies of town that waited on us. There are some up in our rooms now. You can go next. He also apparently, at times, I can tell you from reading the diary, it was a little cold and boring at Johnson's Island. There wasn't much going on. So drinking became an issue sometimes. And he talks about this parade morning, and the officers were in charge of making sure the parade and the inspection went well. So General Shaler rewarded them by calling them to his tent for a reunion or his quarters. When we were assembled, the general politely told us to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Somebody got tight. You can keep going to the next slide. So a regular guy with some weaknesses, or vices I could call them, but at the very end of the war, the 6th Corps, including the 65th, was at a part of what's called the breakthrough attack on April 2nd, 1865, when Grant's army finally broke through the lines of Petersburg and forced Lee into retreat, for him to surrender a week later. And this is from the report of the action. Captains F.J. Volk, Michael Devine, and C.J.C. Ball rendered most efficient services during the assault. Captains Devine and Volk, while in charge of the skirmish line of Boynton Road in danger of being flanked by the enemy, met the danger with coolness and by a handsome change of front checked them. So even if in slow times there were vices, when danger called, Volk was up to the task. Went to the next one. One more guy to talk about. This was the best source I had, a memoir by Andrew Byrne. He's an Irishman, a Fenian, who wrote a memoir which I got permission to use. I found it on a book review, actually, from a blog. There's a guy in Ireland who does a blog on Irish Americans in the Civil War. And he did a review of this book, and I ordered it. It was a self-published book from Ireland. And as soon as I opened it, I realized, oh my God, this is the best source I could possibly have. And I used it so much that I made sure to ask to get permission from the author, or I should say the grandson, I think it's the grandson of Byrne, who's an older guy, who gave me permission to use, to quote from it a lot. And Byrne, I'm just going to use two more quotes from Byrne. You can go to the next one. Byrne talks about life in battle. The first quote talks about his experience at the Battle of Cold Harbor, and he says, "I was struck about the legs with gravel and bits of stone several times. About 6 yards to my right, I heard a thud-like sound. 2 men of my regiment, the front and rear rank man, were knocked out of the ranks with as much ease as if they were 2 chickens, and dashed against the ground where they lay flat and motionless, killed by a cannonball. One was a German and the other an Irishman named Birmingham from Dublin. McNamara, an Irishman next to the German, was splashed with blood and got pale and nervous. He came down to me. I saw the man was weak. I told him to go to the rear." Byrne at this point was a sergeant. "I told him to go to the rear and sit down for a while. I was sorry for Birmingham. He was the victim of a drunken wife in New York who ruined him and his business." And then the next slide. The battlefield of the wilderness is a gorgeous battlefield. The second book I'm going to write is the book that my friends told me to write as we reenacted the 36-mile epic march from Maryland to Gettysburg. They walked with me and they said, "You should be writing about this." And I said, "No, I really want to write a traditional regimental history first. The second book's going to be about sort of my crazy travels and trips." And without getting into too much detail, the trip I took to the wilderness was preceded by an incredibly violent thunder shower. I tried to follow the exact route of the march along this dirt road just north of the Rappahannock River. I drove my Honda Civic, which is a rather low-lying car, Civics, on this dirt road through this giant puddle, made it through, went through an even deeper puddle, and then discretion being the better part of valor, I realized this is not a road I should be on. But I wanted to get right to the place where they crossed the river, because they didn't cross with the rest of the 6th Corps, because they were watching the wagons. So they crossed a different ford. But I decided to turn back, and unfortunately this time I turned back, and the second puddle was so deep, I tried to avoid the middle, that was bad, and I drove into a ditch. And water proceeded to pour into my car, over the front seat, passenger seat, like literally. And I said to myself aloud, alone, "This isn't good." And I realized this is what people watch videos of dumb people that drive in water like this. So I got out, and happily, the guy I was going to meet helped me get out of there. I got towed by a man, and the car survived miraculously. But this is the Cumberland Mine Road, or sorry, the Culpeper Mine Road. This is pretty much what the road would have looked like. You can see the puddle in the foreground. That's sort of evidence for the travails of the weather I was dealing with. But I was lucky enough, again, online, to meet the gentleman who's the premier most knowledgeable person about this road. It goes through a gated community and then ends up on the battlefield. And I was able to follow it through its length. This is the road that the 65th took to the extreme right flank on May 6th. And the next slide will give you another quote. Actually, next slide is just a picture from Harper's Weekly about what the fighting was like. Horrible, horrible fighting. You couldn't see anybody. Sparks from the muskets ignited leaves and brush, and hundreds of men, mostly Union men, were burned alive. You can go to the next slide. I'm not much of a photographer, I confess, but there's a trail that goes along the Union lines. The trenches aren't that well preserved at the Wilderness, but this is a trench, and you can just see, you can't really see it, but if you're there, you can just see there's literally a right angle. So that is the right flank. That's where the 65th was. For me, I'm always looking to try to stand in my great-grandfather's footsteps. And I should say Timothy Carroll survived the war with no wounds until Grant took over. And at Spotsylvania, he was shot through the neck, a flesh wound. He was then wounded again at Cedar Creek, and then he was seriously wounded at Sailor's Creek, which is one of the last battle, really the last big battle between the two armies. So to me, it's testament to Grant's tenacity. He wasn't wounded at all, and then he gets wounded 3 times because Grant just keeps at it the whole time. But one of the last quotes here I'm going to read is Byrne at this spot. If you go to the next slide. Again, trying to show you a little bit about how these guys were regular guys. The gentleman who I share my classroom with, who's read the book, who survived it, who's a huge coffee fan. He's how do I describe him? He only drinks espresso. It has to be from Arthur Avenue in the Bronx. He's a little bit effete about it, frankly. But he loves coffee. So he really got to like Andrew Byrne because Andrew Byrne is always talking about coffee. And here he says, describing the position at the wilderness, he says, a short distance from me to the right and in the open, 5 or 6 men were standing around a small fire making coffee. I could not resist the temptation of making a cup for myself. I got water from one of the men and placed my tin cup on the fire when a bullet struck the ground close to the fire, tearing up the loose soft earth. I moved back a short distance, anxiously waiting for the water to boil. Then another bullet struck the ground near still and knocking part of our fire about. I looked with the greatest curiosity at the men who, notwithstanding the fire, seemed to be a marker for some of the bullets of the enemy, who were nowhere to be seen. Some of the men coolly put their coffee in the boiling water, while another would adjust his cup on the fire that was near toppling over, a bullet having struck the fringe of the fire, disturbing some of the cans. It was now my turn. I put the coffee in my cup. I had merely time to give the water a boil and laid it down near the fire. The dusk of the evening was coming on when a straggling fire opened on our right front, which increased in volume and worked around on our right rear. It is said no soldier can stand a fire in the rear. I heard no order of any kind, so sudden and unexpected was the attack. I had hardly time to look about us in the rear. I could see a swarm of men on the run. There's nothing for it but go or be shot or taken prisoner by the enemy. On the run, we were subject to a heavy fire, which hastened our steps till we got to a road called the Plank Road, where we halted. I went to the rear. This is the part I really like about this quote. I went to the rear in a sort of jog trot, as I wished to save some of my coffee, which I carried with me on the runs. I've always pictured him sort of like running along, trying not to spill the coffee, even while he's getting shot at. And a number of his comrades were captured and ended up imprisoned in Andersonville and dying in Andersonville. There was about 12 chasseurs at the Andersonville National Cemetery. But this little incident I never forgot, yet I have forgotten many things. I may say coffee was the life and strength of our human existence. You can go to the next one. I'm not going to read this, but I found this. This is General Cochran, remember him, back in New York after the war, having a reunion of the officers of the regiment, along with some other higher-ups. And he wrote a poem, which you can read. I put it at the end of the book because I just thought it was an appropriate place for it. Again, Cochran missed out on some of the biggest action, but he was the one who started it all for them, so I think he deserves to be able to get that. Give me the next slide. I'm going to close with this. The cost of the American Civil War and its impact on the men in the 65th New York Volunteers, also known as the 1st United States Chasseurs, would be borne by the men for years to come. All did their duty. In the future, both officers and men can hold their heads high when the battles of this army are mentioned. The Chasseurs represented the best qualities of Americans: fortitude, determination in the face of setbacks, bravery, and steadiness. Perhaps the picture of their emaciated forms casting votes for Abraham Lincoln while trapped inside horrific southern prisons reveals the most. They understood the cause. Their courage, their accomplishments, their sacrifice, and their service should never be forgotten. In their case, there was indeed no flinching from fire. Thank you very much.